lizards, no aliens, no nonsense. This is Reality Bytes.
Welcome to Reality Bytes Radio on the 18th of August 2015. Delighted to welcome back Brandon Turbeville of BrandonTurbeville.com. Strongly suggest you check out his articles there. And hopefully we can hear him if he's not having too many Skype problems. You there, Brandon?
Hey, Neil. Thanks for having me on.
No problem. Okay, a couple of things you wanted to discuss to kick us off. It's a safe zone in Syria and what's happening there at the moment.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of people might keep hearing Syria pop up in the news recently. We had a number of instances where rockets were fired into Latakia, which is the coastal city in the west of Syria, which has largely been a stronghold of the Syrian government. Now we're seeing rockets fired downtown at civilian targets by the moderate rebels, of course, that the United States supports and funds and trains and arms. But we recently had this question of the no-fly zone, which of course was renamed an ISIL-free zone, and it's these Orwellian terms or semantical terms that whenever they want to impose a no-fly zone or a buffer zone, they'll call it a different name. Remember, this is what happened in Libya. Whenever they applied a no-fly zone to Libya, they ended up bombing the Libyan government forces and essentially invading the state of Libya and allowing ISIS forces to take over there. Of course, it was called something else at the time. It was called the Libyan Islamic Fighting Groups. And they wanted to do the same thing in Syria. They called it a no-fly zone, and that was a little obvious, so they moved it to a buffer zone. They changed the name to buffer zone. And then when buffer zone became a little more obvious, it was moved to safe zone. Well, now the new title is an ISIL-free zone. So it's like the Diet Coke style, marketing is basically, it's sugar-free, right? We got ISIL-free here in Syria now, but it really should be called an ISIL-free range zone, and we'll get into that in a second. I think a lot of people might also be kind of confused as to why the Turks would bomb the Kurds as opposed to ISIS. So I want to mention that. To just go back a bit, the Turkish direct military involvement hasn't really begun with this recent round of bombing. Remember, the Turks have bombed inside Syria a couple of times. In fact, they did so about a year ago under the guise of protecting the tomb of Süleyman Shah, it's a Turkish enclave, but it was actually revealed that the Turks had allowed and encouraged death squad forces to close in on that tomb so they could justify a cross-border invasion. And actually, it was only used as a pretext to get the Turkish forces in. It was not really a threat. They used it as a pretext, and they actually had recordings of Turkish officials planning this false flag event so they could justify an invasion. They had recordings that were released in the media shortly thereafter. But this recent round of bombing comes on the end of the Suruk bombing in Turkey, and this was a suicide bomber that detonated a bomb in the middle of a crowd. It was a demonstration. It was a peaceful demonstration by individuals, largely Kurdish people, who were in that demonstration. The bomb goes off, and immediately ISIS takes credit for it, right? Well, and to give the Turks much more credibility and much more respect than the American people, the Turks immediately knew who was responsible for this, because when the Turkish government was screaming, it's ISIS that detonated a suicide bomb, the Turkish people knew that it was the Turkish government that was behind this, right? So they didn't fall for the false flag. But shortly thereafter, there was a killing. Actually, there were two killings of Turkish police officers. The PKK took credit for the killing of these police officers. Or at least it was blamed on the PKK. I guess I'll say it that way. The PKK was blamed for killing these two police officers in response to the Suruk bombing. All right, so I guess it is important to say that PKK was blamed, because there is a difference. And immediately after the bombing, we have the Turkish government coming out and saying that they were going to crack down on ISIS forces, on ISIS members inside Turkey. So we had this massive operation where Turkish police, Turkish military swooped in and arrested hundreds and hundreds of individuals across the country. Well, it was presented to the Western public as a crackdown on ISIS, and of course there was a few individuals who were terrorists that were arrested, but the overwhelming majority of people who were arrested were actually Kurds who were connected in some way to the PKK. Simultaneously to the crackdown across the country, we had the Turkish bombing inside Syria and Iraq, and they were bombing, as presented to us, ISIS forces. But again, in reality, the overwhelming amount of targets were Kurdish targets, and that's the YPG in Syria, the PKK in Turkey, and the Peshmerga forces, I guess you'd call them the KDP or the PUK in Iraq. These were the targets of the Kurdish bombing. Now, Neil, I know you know quite a bit about the Turkish and Kurdish question here, but for those who don't, the individuals, the Kurds and the Turks have been in this battle for quite some time. Since the early 1980s, they've been fighting with one another. The Kurds particularly are interested in more political autonomy, and of course there is discrimination and poor treatment that is leveled against the Kurds. They want either better treatment. It can go from desires for better treatment or to autonomy or to actual independence and having a Kurdish state, a Kurdistan in that region. And of course Turkey is resisting that, and has resisted since the 1980s. So that battle has been raging for some time. It continued until the late 1990s. There was some small amount of peace. There was a ceasefire that was declared in 1999, which lasted until about 2004, when the fighting picked up again and became increasingly physical between the two forces. And in 2013, we had peace. Well, in between 2013 and back to 2004, there was a sort of a lull in the fighting. But in 2013, Erdogan, in his foolish decision to support savages and death squad terrorists and so forth in Syria, has led to the increase in tensions, and now we're starting to see the violence start up again. Now, for people who are confused as to why Turkey is bombing Syria and Iraq and the Kurds in general, there's really two big reasons that this is happening, right? The first is the question of a Kurdistan, the creation of this independent Kurdish country that's being discussed here. And of course, if you look on the map, you'll see that in the eastern parts of Turkey, and of course the northern part of Syria, the western part of Iraq, actually it kind of goes across the Iraqi northern border for quite a while as well, and then into the westernmost parts of Iran. We see this is where the Kurds are most heavily populated, right? So there's this question of whether or not there should be an independent Kurdistan, and the Turks have been opposed to this for quite some time, and that's been the basis of the battles back and forth. So the Turks are not going to have this idea of a Kurdistan take shape. They're not going to allow it peaceably. Certainly, they're not going to just allow this to happen. And the Erdogan, the president of Turkey, has this foolish ideology that it's almost as if he believes he's going to be the leader of the new Ottoman Empire, right? This is a question that a lot of people have made the claims that Erdogan actually believes that he's going to be the new caliph of the new Ottoman Empire. That's not going to happen, and precisely not going to happen because he has joined forces with NATO, of which Turkey is a part, to destroy Syria. But the reason that this Kurdistan issue has really been taking off recently is because precisely of the actions of Turkey, right? We have the ISIS fighters in Iraq and Syria, and of course being funneled through Turkey. The Kurds have been one of the most effective fighting forces against ISIS in both of those countries, in Iraq and Syria. And in fact, if you look on the map, you'll see the sizable amounts of territory that the Kurds have defended and have retaken back from ISIS. The Kurds have managed to take most of the northern border between Turkey and Syria. In Iraq, they've taken a sizable amount of territory there as well. And so what you're seeing is that Kurds on the Syrian border, the YPG, and the Kurds on the Iraqi side of the border are starting to coordinate with each other. So you got four pieces to the puzzle here in terms of the Kurdistan issue, and two of them are starting to coordinate. And shortly before the bombing, there was increasing coordination between the Kurds in Syria and Iraq and the Kurds in Turkey. Of course, the Kurds in Iraq and Turkey have been coordinating for some time. The PKK in Turkey has bases in Iraq where they coordinate. Well, now the Kurds in Iraq and Syria are starting to unite, and the Kurds in Syria and Turkey are starting to unite. So you're getting about three pieces of the puzzle coming together to present this danger of a Kurdistan, and again, danger in the minds of the Turkish government. If you have a situation like this, and if you look at again on the map, you'll see where the Syrian government holds territory. And I've got a good map in my article, Turkey's War on the Kurds, ISIS Air Force flies again. You'll see on the map where the Syrian government maintains its territory. And again, this is mainly western Syria into part of southern Syria and on up right about to Aleppo. And you'll see the areas that ISIS maintains, which is eastern Syria, western Iraq. And essentially the northern border now taken over mostly by the Kurds, is separated from the Syrian army by ISIS, and the same thing in Iraq. So the odds of any Syrian government moving in, knocking ISIS out, and then moving in to stop the Kurds is pretty low. The same thing there taking place in Iraq. So you're starting to see a de facto Kurdistan take shape. You know, these northern Syria, northern and western Iraq, and then, of course, the eastern part of Turkey, all right there together. You're getting this de facto Kurdistan. If you get a de facto Kurdistan, you will end up with a real Kurdistan, and this is what the Turks just will not allow to happen. So that's one main reason that the bombing of the Kurds is taking place right now. The second reason is probably even equally important in a way, is that the Kurds have essentially cut off ISIS from the supply lines coming in from Turkey. And again, I want to refer to that map that's in my article. If you look at the northern part of the Syrian-Turkey border, you'll see that all the way from the eastern tip of the northern part of the Syrian border with Turkey, and that goes all the way to well past the central part. It goes west past the central part of the Turkey-Syria border. That's what the Kurdish forces have taken back. There's a small portion of land in between that and the far western part of the Syrian border, Syria-Turkey border, and that is still controlled by ISIS forces. But then you get to the far western tip of the Syria-Turkey border, and you have Kurdish control again. So there's this little bottleneck area of territory where ISIS still controls the Turkey-Syria border. The Kurdish forces have been moving in on that area for quite some time, and already in the areas where they've taken over, they've managed to cut the supply lines. Again, the ISIS forces' supply lines are coming in from Turkey. They've only got this one small bottleneck area where they can come in now, and you can see on the map that the Turks were closing in on that. So if you look at what's happening with the bombing, attacking the Kurds, then it's pretty clear that the Turks are acting as an air force for Al-Qaeda, right? They're coming in to make sure that this bottleneck remains open. Now, the question of the ISIL free zone, if you'll look on the map, that same little bottleneck area, essentially from the eastern part of that little zone, would be Jarablus in the east, and it would go west to a place called Dabik. And that is about 60 to 68 miles wide, about 45 miles deep into Syria. That's the ISIL free zone. It's also precisely the zone that is controlled currently by ISIS. And it's also the same general area where the Turks are bombing to make sure that the Kurds are not in. So if you look at the map, you can see clearly what's happening is the Turks and the United States have declared an ISIL free zone, but really is what I call an ISIL free range zone, because they're attempting to keep these supply lines open. They don't want the Turks to close off that small area of the Turkey-Syria border, because if they do, ISIS supply lines are cut. Remember, the Syrian government has worked with Hezbollah to cut off the borders between Syria and Lebanon. There's only one or two areas where they haven't closed it off, but these are very small, not much getting through there. The southern part of Syria that borders the occupied Golan Heights has been there's been a major push along with the Iranian forces to cut those borders to keep supplies from coming in through Israel. And there's also the southern border of Syria with Jordan, which many of those border crossings have been cut off as well. So there's very few small areas where these supply lines can come through, except for that area where the ISIL free zone has been declared. And if that was cut off, basically the supply lines to ISIS have been thoroughly cut, almost 100% cut, and they're left. They're landlocked. They're not bordering any other country besides Iraq and Syria, two countries that are cooperating and fighting ISIS. So it would have essentially eliminated the ability of ISIS to supply itself and to maintain itself. So that's why we're seeing this ISIL free zone being declared now. It has nothing to do with actually fighting ISIS. It has to do with protecting it and protecting the ISIS supply routes.
Well, I mean, it's very clear when you look at the map that it's all done through NATO, because that's the only area on the map that's NATO controlled, the border with Turkey. In terms of, you mentioned, I knew about Turkey. I lived there for a while, and it's funny you mentioned 1999 when the peace treaty was supposedly signed. But I'd been going there on holiday for maybe 8 or 9 years before that, and the Kurdish problem was never really spoken about by anybody. You didn't bring it up because it was kind of taboo. It was like talking about religion in Ireland or something. You went down some of the streets in some of the little fishing villages. There were bars on either side. One side were owned by Kurds, and the other side were owned by Turks, and they got on fine. There was never a problem. It was only when the Turkish military was conscripting young lads to go off to eastern Turkey to get into what they called their Vietnam back then. This was the early 90s, or late 80s, and they called it their own Vietnam. And these kids were coming back really screwed up. I mean, we talk about PTSD here. These guys were biting their tongues off in discotheques and stuff like that, just because of the stuff they'd seen. They talk about seeing their friends blowing up and heads rolling down the street and all that kind of stuff. And it was quite horrific. But in terms of, we know who's funding ISIS and all the rest of them. I mean, who is anybody behind the Kurds, or is it actually a kind of ground roots, kind of get off a land kind of type thing?
Well, that's that at times can be a very complicated issue, because the Iraqi Kurds, the PUK or the Peshmerga, whatever you call them, they go by a number of different names. So Peshmerga generally is the name that that you hear in reference to the Iraqi Kurds. There have been some pretty close ties with American intelligence in the past between the Iraqi Kurds. The Syrian Kurds, not so much until recently, actually. There's actually been reports that the Syrian Kurds, the YPG, have been working a bit with the Free Syrian Army, which is very questionable, because as we've talked about here on this show before, the Free Syrian Army and ISIS, well, it's just a name, right? What's in a name? It's not much. There's the PKK in Turkey, of course, has been working with some of the Iraqi Kurds. They've had bases in Iraq, but there hasn't really been that much evidence that there's any intelligence ties between the PKK and the YPG with American intelligence. But there has been in the past connections with American intelligence, in terms of things that have happened with Saddam Hussein and various other issues. So it bears watching, because there's always an agenda afoot. You can always wonder whether or not the Kurds are being allowed to cooperate to some degree to be given this pipe dream of a Kurdistan, but really being used kind of like a North Korea, the strategy of tension, to be able to bring Turkish power back toward the NATO realm, to use it as a back and forth kind of a battering ram or carrot and stick motif. But there has been some Western intelligence connections with the Kurds in Iraq, not as much with the ones in Syria and Turkey.
Yeah, I mean, I was always under the impression when I was over there that this was just people trying to protect the land, basically. After the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, they kind of saw the opportunity to get their own kind of place, and that was the sense I got of it. But again, you couldn't find out much, because it was a kind of dangerous thing to talk about back then.
Yeah, and I think if people will look at this, that the Kurds don't generally tend to be some minor little group of religious fanatics who demand a state based on some obscure religion or something. Generally, I'm against the idea of the micro-state, mini-state Brzezinski method, but I think that after these years of fighting and the fact that the Kurds are are different people to some degree, that if anybody's earned their own state, I think the Kurds have earned it.
Well, I mean, you could turn the argument that Israel uses, well, we were always there, so it's our land, and apply it to the Kurds. They've always been there, so surely they're entitled to it.
Yeah, and the Kurds have been there longer.
Yeah, well, exactly. Yeah. I mean, if Israel wants to make up stories to say they're there all the time, that's what they do, and everybody goes, oh yeah, they were there 2,000 years ago, blah blah blah. Well, they've got to apply the same rules to these people as well.
Well, that would get in the way of the double standard of the Middle East, which has been causing so many problems to begin with, right, with the Israelis.
Yeah, of course. Okay, final word on that one?
Well, that's, I would just caution people also, we've had reports yesterday coming out that Israel has been conducting drills, military drills regarding a ground invasion into Syria, and we don't know how serious this is. This could be preparations for an actual ground assault in Syria, or it could be what the Brookings Institution labeled the multi-front war. In other words, now that we've got the ISIL free zone with the Americans and the Turks bombing the Kurds and bombing into Syrian territory, and the Americans now with the ISIL free zone in the north, we've also got the Israelis massing forces on the border in the south. So the idea is to have Assad always going back and forth as to what side of the country he should send the most forces, constantly going back and forth trying to figure out where the biggest threat is at one time, and thereby having to split his forces and weakening his defenses. So that's something to bear in mind when we are paying attention to the Middle East right now. What's Israel doing? But again, it could be the Brookings Institution multi-front war theory at work as well.
Your next article was on vaccine propaganda, and just as a footnote to that, I did see in one of the UK papers, I think it was today or yesterday, that they're now talking about a breast cancer vaccine. I mean, if anything's going to scare the bejesus out of women, there you go. There's the perfect vaccine to go after their femininity, if you like, and scare them into getting this thing out. I don't know, 10 or 12 years old, no doubt, or whatever. That's just another piece, the fear mongering.
Yeah, and this new propaganda narrative regarding the vaccines. This was something. In case people don't notice, that just because you see an article in Time doesn't mean that Time's the only place it appears, right? This pro-vaccination propaganda came out first. I first read about it in an article called "How to Change an Anti-Vaxxer's Mind." It was written by Jeffrey Kloger of Time magazine. But within hours, different versions of this same article appeared in numerous mainstream media publications. One's on the right, one's on the left, one's in the so-called middle. And the basic idea was that you can't argue with, it's based on a study that was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. They were saying that you can't argue with an anti-vaxxer with facts. You can't argue with an anti-vaxxer with logic. So what you should do is to show them pictures of sick children to show them what would happen if they don't vaccinate, right? And that was more convincing, because the idea was that when you try to beat someone over the head with an argument, that they either you win, or they dig their heels in whether they're right or not. So just show them pictures of what happens if they don't vaccinate, and that's more effective than trying to argue with them. And that was the idea of this Time magazine piece. Of course, if you break that down, what they're saying is, don't argue the facts, don't use logic, just show scary pictures to people who don't vaccinate and try to scare them into taking the vaccination. And of course, that might work on the average person who doesn't understand vaccine dangers, who doesn't understand their ability to opt out of vaccines, or doesn't really pay attention to what's going on in the world, and certainly not doing research. But anybody who actually understands the science of vaccination and the dangers surrounding it are not going to be convinced by these scary pictures. But what it is an attempt to continue this, to promote this bullying, social shaming attempt that's being promoted by the mainstream media to really all sides of the anti-vaccination camp. But really they are gearing up people typically on the left to go out and really bully and shame people, because of course, you know, with all of our social divisions, and we become radicalized based on all of our little tiny groupings and cliques. One of the areas where people become really radicalized on is this area of vaccination and scientism. In other words, you know, you've got the hipsters, the trendies who always worship what I call scientism, what they would refer to as science, but it's not really science. As long as it goes under the garb of science, they can throw it up in your face. I mean, I'm sure you know the groups I'm talking about, right? Where it's cool to be a nerd, and it's cool to be a scientist, and all that kind of stuff. The hipster crowd. And what's funny to me is that there were a number of bills, like the people who were behind this, there were a number of bills that came out in North Carolina, and then of course we had the California bill, and there was one in Vermont as well. And all of these bills were an attempt to remove the religious exemption, because that goes right along with the trendy hipster mindset, right? Because it's definitely religion that's causing people to not vaccinate. So we need to remove this religious exemption, or remove the philosophical exemption, or both, right? In North Carolina, there was a bill that was submitted by Jeff Tart, who is a genuinely awful human being. If anybody knows about Jeff Tart, you could just Google my name and his, and you could see some of his greatest hits and the way he interacts with constituents. But it was submitted by Jeff Tart, and it would have applied to all children, not children just in public school. It wouldn't have removed the exemptions, vaccine exemptions for those children. It would have, if you were homeschooling your children, they would have had to show proof of immunization. You know, that's how wide-ranging that bill actually was, and it thankfully didn't pass, but the bill in California did pass. And what's so funny about the whole situation is that the individuals who were really pushing for this the hardest tended to be groups on the left, you know, the trendy groups on the left that were promoting this. Well, we did some digging to find out who was behind this push, and of course we know who's behind it at the top, but in terms of the specific actual physical guiding hand of these bills, what turned out to be behind it was ALEC, and that's the American Legislative Exchange Council. And ALEC is the boogeyman for the left, right? ALEC is to the right what George Soros is to the left, right? They fund a lot of these right-wing initiatives the same way George Soros funds the left-wing initiatives like Black Lives Matter and stuff like that. ALEC, along with Koch Industries, they fund a lot of these right-wing austerity initiatives and wedge issue initiatives and that sort of thing, to get people going with the Republican Party. And so it's incredibly ironic that ALEC would have been behind the senators introducing these bills into Congress when it's the lefties who are out supporting the cause, right? So now we've got crossovers. That's why I titled my article, "Congratulations, leftists, you got fooled by Koch," because that's exactly what happened. And if you try to tell people this, they react irrationally, of course, because if you're on the left, you couldn't possibly have gotten fooled by Koch. That's for stupid Luddite Republican people to get fooled by, but not you. So people should really research this group if they haven't heard about it. But essentially, they have this council where they get together. It's supposed to be a non-profit institution where they have board members from corporations, from banks, from different industries, and they bring on congressmen, and this is at the state level, not at the national level, it's the state level. So they bring the congressmen who also sit on the board, right next to the industrial giants and the banking giants and the pharmaceutical companies, that sort of thing, and they create model legislation. Some of these guys get paid to speak, they get paid to travel, and then the legislation is created for them. It's just a model, though, of course, and then it's handed to them where they go to Congress and they submit it, and because they think it's great legislation, apparently, and they they submit it. That it sometimes gets passed, sometimes doesn't. But they have a pretty good track record of the amount of the percentage of bills that they submit and the percentage of bills that actually get passed. So it's a pretty good track record. Again, it's every state, and it's at the state level. So they can get these agendas done at the state level as opposed to having to push forward on the national level. But that's the group that's been one of the biggest pushers behind this vaccine agenda, the American Legislative Exchange Council.
Well, I mean, we could go down the road of playing them at their own game, because, of course, the American equivalent of I think the UK one's called the Vaccine Damage Payment Scheme. That's an actual government department. And I know the one in America, I can't remember the name of it, has paid out $3 billion in vaccine damage. So why don't we just get pictures of vaccine damaged children and say, well, this is what happens when you do vaccinate yourself, you know?
Exactly. I encourage people on my show to if you want to go down that route, if you want to not argue logic and show scary pictures, well, we've got plenty. We can show the pictures of the kids with the disease, since the vaccine often causes the disease it's supposed to prevent. We could show a picture of a child with the measles and say, you see what happens when you vaccinate your child?
Well, I mean, I think the particularly good one would be the polio one, that shows it's only ever been known to be inside the vaccine. That type of polio that Bill Gates is spreading around the world, it's always been vaccine induced because it doesn't exist in nature.
Yeah, and there's a polio campaign in Africa right now, and that's where Bill Gates has really been spending a lot of money promoting that vaccine, and they've been saying that that wild polio has been eliminated in these number of countries where the Bill Gates initiatives and so forth are at. But what you don't read in the fine print, that are saying the wild polio has been eliminated. Yeah, but how many cases of vaccine-produced, vaccine-based polio are there? And there's tens of thousands of these cases every year. In fact, at one point there was even more of those than there were of wild polio cases. Wild polio is actually more rare. So. And it's not always. It doesn't always cause paralysis either. Well, that's another fear-mongering technique.
Yeah, and they also renamed polio aseptic meningitis, and there's a lot of cases of that these days. But no polio, of course. They just call it something else. It's like your ISIS or ISIL. Whatever. Call it what you want. It doesn't matter.
But you still need the polio vaccine and the meningitis vaccine. So now you can get two.
Yeah, well, they've actually got an ad on the TV here. I'm sure you've probably seen it, maybe. The meningitis one, and they show this guy lying in the bed with his mother, and he looks like he's in his mid-20s or 30s. And they say, well, even if he was vaccinated as a child, he still has to get another one, or this could happen to him. So that goes right into what you've just been saying about showing scary pictures. These are TV ads now coming out.
Yeah, and conveniently at the same time. And this vaccine push is not going away. I think one of the things that is the most scary issue about this vaccine propaganda push was that nobody was talking about vaccines until the media started talking about it, right? And it only took about a week before people who at first had not even thought about vaccines, or who maybe questioned vaccination, or maybe didn't question vaccination but tolerated people who questioned it and didn't practice it, before they became raving lunatics trying to bully people and shame people into taking the vaccines and just attacking them in public and that sort of thing, trying to bully them into doing it. It only took about a week of propaganda to get them that way. That's the same thing that happened here in South Carolina with the Confederate flag. Nobody was talking about that damn flag until every single media outlet in the country, and even media outlets in Europe, were talking about the Confederate flag. And then suddenly we had racial issues and fights on the state capitol grounds and stuff over the flag, and everybody in the country talking about the history of the Civil War and racial prejudice and all that kind of stuff. Nobody was talking about it. In that situation, it only took about 12 hours to get people at each other's throats. But that tells you how we're already connected to this hive mind that is the television and the mainstream media, because they can put this stuff out and have an entire population at each other's throats within hours.
you should mention the thing about the flag. I was in the car driving down the road there, and had turned the local radio station on to see what the traffic was like. And they've got this guy on, this duo in the morning, Mickey Mouse and Dumbo or whatever, talking rubbish. And they were talking about the flag thing, and one of the presenters, who's a local guy down mid-central Florida, he's saying, well, I don't know what they're complaining about. They're a conquered nation, the South. That's how he described the South, as a conquered nation, And I thought that guy's asking to be lynched, It's, that was just a funny take. I just thought, I mean, that's like me saying that about Scotland. You're a conquered nation. You stop complaining about the English. But there you go. Okay, moving on. Another health threat, GMO. Now, it was announced last week that Scotland had apparently banned outright all GMO crops, and yet when you read down on the article, which appeared on, I think it was in some of the mainstream media, but I got it from one of the independent ones to get a better take on it. You read down the article and they start talking about it. It doesn't refer to genetically modified organisms that have already been passed for cultivation in European states. Scotland now has to go back to the European Union and ask permission not to grow these things from the European Union. But I kind of get the impression that this is just a gimmick to let people think that GMOs aren't already on the supermarket shelves, when we all know they are. Well, I mean, you and I do, but the general public don't. They think that all the food in the supermarket shelves is perfectly okay, and there's no GM in it. And I wrote to one of the big supermarket chains back in the UK, Tesco's, and I wrote to Asda as well, which of course is Walmart, and asked them how many genetically modified products they had on their shelves. And it says, well, to our knowledge, we have none. So, in reply to that, I said, well, how about everything with aspartame in it? That's got genetically modified ingredients in it. And that was the end of that conversation.
Yeah, they didn't tell you they had zero to no knowledge, right?
Well, they obviously had no knowledge at all. But again, I mean, it's propaganda to say that they're going to ban GMOs outright when they know full well it's already right through the food chain.
Well, from what I understood, I did a little cursory research into this, and when I understood that the ban does apply to all crops, including the ones that were grown other places, like the MON 810 or I think MON 180, I believe, that's grown in the UK. That it does apply, but as you point out, that just because it's not being grown doesn't mean it's not in the food supply, right? Because a lot of the food is imported. And if it's imported, that it can contain GMOs, from what I understand. So you're right. It's still in the food supply. I think it's a step in the right direction, but the UK, or at least England, seems to be going in the opposite direction. They continue to liberalize their GMO crops and the ability to grow crops there as well. But yeah, I mean, maybe I should look at this more. But from what I understand, the ban would apply to all crops that are grown. It wouldn't apply to crops that are grown in a laboratory for research, which is fine. But it would be able to be applied to all crops that were grown to begin with in Scotland, and the crops that are currently grown in the EU. If they chose not to grow them there, that would be okay. That was my understanding of the law.
Well, I mean, people in America might know what's out in the UK. I mean, Scotland shares a border with England. Now, England is openly testing GMO crops down in Norfolk, as far as I'm aware. I used to live down that way, and they're open air. They're not in a controlled environment or anything, and a lot of people have gone down there, ripped the fences down, and done some damage there, which fair play to them. And in terms of Southern Ireland, which isn't part of the UK, when Northern Ireland is, Southern Ireland is now considering growing GM potatoes there. So I mean, it's just a blast of wind. It's going to be the difference between whether GM crops are in Scotland or Northern Ireland, as far as I'm aware. And what's Scotland going to do if England decides to plant GM crops from one coast to the other on the Scottish border? Nothing.
Yeah, there's nothing they can do. There's nothing they can do. It's just going to go over the border and contaminate the non-GMO crops, right?
Well, down in that area, it's mainly livestock, and particularly on the kind of central Scotland east as well. It's mainly livestock. We know that Edinburgh is where they brought out Dolly the sheep time and time again, although it was a different sheep and they never told anybody because the genetically modified kept dying. But I'm sure there must be genetically modified sheep in Scotland at this point. I'd be surprised if there wasn't.
Well, I wouldn't doubt that there is either. I mean, it was in Canada. They grew genetically modified crops and put it through the food chain for at least 10 years before the Canadian people even knew that they were eating GMOs, before they even knew that there was the potential that genetically modified food was going to be introduced to Canada. They had been eating it for 10 years. So we're always the last to know what's in our food supply.
Yeah, and of course, a lot of the food products they give to the animals are GM anyway. So it doesn't make any difference. As I say, it's already on the supermarket shelves, and I agree. It is a step in the right direction, but there's a bit of a lying by omission going on, I think, here, and not to tell you that where are the supermarkets? Why aren't the supermarkets coming out and saying, okay, we'll follow your lead. We won't stock anything with GM in it.
Notice, too, that in Scotland there's a lot of farmers' organizations, and I put farmers' organizations in quotes, that are coming out and speaking out against this new law. And I'd be interested to see how many of those farmers' organizations have ties to major corporations like Monsanto or Dow or whatever the equivalent might be. I'm sure there's some European-based ones as well. I'd like to see if they had any connections to that, because we have farmers' organizations here. One of the ones that fund Hillary Clinton, or helping organize for Hillary Clinton, her campaign, is closely linked to Monsanto, but I think it's Farmers for America or something like that. Don't quote me. I'd have to go back and get the name. It sounds like a nice farmers organization, but it's actually a front for Monsanto. But a lot of the farmers themselves are actually, at least over here, are so dependent upon genetically modified crops that a lot of times if you go out and argue against GMOs, you'll have to fight the farmers too, and that's unfortunate. But that's the way the situation is here. But I'd like to see I saw a number of farmers organizations in Scotland that were really upset about this law. And, to my knowledge, they were not growing GMO crops in Scotland anyway. So why they say it's going to make them less competitive? Well, are they not competing now? It's.
Scotland's famous for exporting most of its food anyway. So I think a lot of this is down to the politics of it. Possibly other countries where they export food to are saying we're not going to take it if it's GM, and that'll be it. That'll be the Scottish economy finished. But again, like what you said about the farmers there, most of the land in Scotland isn't owned by Scottish people. It's owned by foreign companies. So and foreign individuals. It's still kind of run under the old baron system. The lords and ladies and that owned all the land. And I don't know if they're still incorporated to these companies or not. But certainly big corporations own a lot of Scotland, and the farmers are basically tenants. Well, and they're certainly
moving in the right direction from the point of view of an oligarch with the Gerfix system now that's in place over there. So certainly individual rights are not a concern.
Well, they only have one police force for the whole of Scotland now as well. They used to have 8. So it's all being monopolised into these huge organisations, and I'm sure that the farmers are no different. I'm sure all these little farmers' institutions, certainly the major ones, are all tied together in some way or another and all singing from the same hymn sheet. But anyway, moving on. This whole thing that's coming up, 2016, the American election, we've got the same old characters stepping forward. We've got Jeb Bush, you've got Hillary Clinton, even Al Gore standing up now saying he's going to run again. In a country where anybody can become president, it's becoming a bit farcical, isn't it?
Anybody can become president. That's why we choose 2 cousins from Skull and Bones to run from Democrat and Republican parties. That's a big, huge lie perpetrated on the American public. But it's almost the way I see about the presidential debates here in the U.S. is that It's a lot like watching football, right? You can watch the Democrats versus the Republicans in the same way that you can watch the Redskins versus the Cowboys, and it doesn't matter who wins because the NFL makes the money. Well, in this situation, it doesn't really matter who wins because the world oligarchy, wins regardless of which team might win the election. The difference between the election and football is that, in football, I don't sit around and hope somebody gets hurt. But with the debates, if you watch the Republican debate, which was a horrifying experience for anybody that doesn't want more war, that doesn't want austerity, or doesn't want torture, or their civil liberties eviscerated. I mean, it was a contest between who could love Israel the most, who could torture the most, who could bomb the most people, and who could shred the Bill of Rights the fastest. And to be honest, it was quite the contest, because I'm not really sure which one could have done that. Jeb Bush, you're right. He just recently came out and said, living up to the Bush family name of being a nitwit, he mumbled his way through the Republican debate, and he mumbled and bumbled his way through the question over torture, but ultimately came down on the same side of his brother and of his successor Obama, that torture was fine, and that he would not commit to not torturing people. And as we could see, it was sold to us to begin with on the idea that it would be used for terrorists overseas, and it has been used on American citizens on a number of occasions, and not long after 9/11 was it used on American citizens. Not that it was right to do that to terrorist suspects anyway. It's not. But we can see the same agenda moving forward. And the question of Hillary Clinton, I have to be coy for now, but if people are interested in Hillary, they should keep checking my website, because I'm going to be having some information coming out about Hillary pretty soon that they might find interesting. But you can put Hillary up with any Republican up with Hillary, and it's going to be quite the contest of more war, more austerity, more shredding of the Bill of Rights, and more oppression, poor economic choices and that sort of thing, or economic choices that benefit the banks. And there's nothing to really expect positive out of this. There's not one single person in the race. At least in years past, we could have that one token guy that we could say, well, at least he's not perfect, but at least he's got some decent ideas, and we don't even have that now. We don't even have the token guy who's going to lose by 98% of the vote.
No, we have them in the UK. We've got enough of them. In terms of the sporting analogy, it'd be quite entertaining to put them all in a boxing ring or something and just watch them slog it out, and we wouldn't care who got hurt, because we'd want them all to get hurt. But I still think Hillary would win. Doesn't matter who's up against her.
She's too bloodthirsty, yeah.
Yeah, we were going through some stuff that we'd shifted from the old house, and we came across a Hillary Clinton doll, which is actually a nutcracker, and I won't bore you with where she cracks her nuts and how you use that implement. But anyway, I mean, the thing about Jeb Bush and his admission that he's quite willing to use torture, and I actually think the American public might go for it, because they'll think, we've got to get rid of these nasty terrorists. They're going to come over here and perpetrate another 9/11 or whatever. But people don't realise that he's talking about using it on them as well.
Well, we already went for it. We went for it after 9/11, but we called it enhanced interrogation. Now we're just going to go for the same thing and call it torture. That's the only difference. Remember, we had this debate early on between whether or not waterboarding was torture, even though waterboarding was probably, it was bad, but it was not as bad as what was actually happening when they were raping little children and raping inmates and stuff like that. They didn't really talk about that, and that's documented in a report by General Taguba that analyzed this stuff when he went over to Abu Ghraib and a couple of other prisons. He said all this stuff was taking place, but the question was over enhanced interrogation. And as always, what happens is that the so-called debate began, and we have people who say we don't support torture, and the other side that comes out and says, oh, well, we have to support torture. And then there's this debate of, well, is it acceptable in some instances? Is it not acceptable in some instances? And it sounds much like a college classroom where college students are led through a number of scenarios. Do they reach the ultimate goal that the professor wants them to reach to? Maybe that they do something that morally they wouldn't have done to begin with because of moral relativism. We end up reaching that same conclusion. And if you just keep the debate going on for 2 weeks, people who don't support torture or don't support this evisceration of the Bill of Rights will simply run out of steam. And that's our problem, is that the average person will give up. They'll get distracted by something else, and then ultimately the so-called debate always comes down on the side of the government or the oppressor. Same thing with the massive surveillance. At first, you were a conspiracy theorist if you said we were being surveilled by the government, and then it was admitted, and then we debated about it for about a week, and then everyone lost interest, and now we all just assume that everything we do or say is being recorded, and nobody really cares, to be honest. A very small portion of the American public actually cares, but the vast majority couldn't care less.
Yeah, well, it's the same in the UK, unfortunately. In terms of Jeb Bush, do you think the Republican supporters will see him as some kind of tough guy because he's willing to perpetrate torture, even although he's never going to get anywhere near somebody to torture, unless it's his wife, I guess. But I'm sure it's torture enough for her, sitting with him every night. But do you think there'll be a sizable group will see this guy as a tough guy because he's actually come out and admitted that he's willing to torture people?
I think the overwhelming majority of Republicans will see him as a tough guy because he wants to support torture. Again, watching the Republican debate is a horrifying experience every 4 years. I do it every 4 years, and every 4 years I'm horrified because the ability to torture, the ability to blow up children in schools and that sort of thing with F-16s is not considered a negative thing. That's a positive thing. And right now, Jeb is not getting the attention that maybe he normally would have gotten, but simply because Donald Trump is running around. And again, that gives you an example of what people like in politics. The guy's got no substance, but he's insulting, and he talks tough, and so that's what works with the Republican primary. But at the end of the day, the Republicans will sober up and realize they want a guy who really wants to start more wars overseas and provoke Russia and maybe invade Iran and torture innocent people for whatever reason, under the guise of national security, and they'll fall in line with Jeb. So it'll be interesting. I feel like we're going to see a Hillary-Jeb debate.
I still think Hillary will get it just because she's getting on a bit, and Jeb will come around next time. I don't know. But are we going to see maybe Clinton getting in within 2 months? She gets a Peace Prize.
Well, she'd have to start a war first, I guess. I
doubt it'd take her very long.
Well, as she was Secretary of State for a few years, she managed to get into 2. So I don't know if that counts. Maybe she'll just get one automatically for that.
Yeah, retrospectively.
Well, I don't know how much longer we have. We've got a couple minutes here, but again, I would just encourage people to keep going to my website and checking it regularly, because I will have some information coming out on Hillary, and of course we're still following the Syrian situation, which appears to be heating up a bit with the Israelis and the Turks and the Americans trying to continue to provoke the situation and provoke some type of direct military conflict. And of course we forgot to even mention the fact that the Russians, there's apparently been this talk between Putin and Erdogan, where Putin was very angry at the Turks for implementing this ISIL free zone, and there are some issues with the Turk Stream pipeline, which is apparently not going ahead as planned now. So this is all stuff to be watched very closely. A lot of things are coming together that don't seem to bode well for our future.
To finish off, we've got a library that costs like £1 billion or something, or some crazy amount of money in Birmingham, and they're actually asking the public for books because they can't afford to buy books anymore. And at the same time, I read that Obama is now building a library for $1 billion when he can barely read without a teleprompter. I find that quite ironic.
Well, we sent all of our money overseas to bomb people. We can't afford to build things like libraries or fund Social Security or things like that.
Yeah, well, Obama's building one for himself, apparently, going to cost $1 billion. And it's twice as much as what George Bush raised to build his library. You know, so
with George Bush and Barack Obama library, is that not the definition of irony?
Absolutely. That's what I thought I'd finish on. Anyway, great to have you back on again, Brandon, and won't leave it so long next time. Take care and keep the articles coming.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Pleasure.